Okay, this is part 2 of Chapter 4, Foreign Policy in the International Relations course. We've already talked about the primary goals of foreign policy and that it's initiated in the President's office. So now we want to talk about some primary influences on foreign policy, domestic influences in particular. The first one we'll look at is domestic influences and the bureaucratic elements of that. Diplomacy is something that is ongoing, incremental, and it's a form of information gathering that the United States and all democratic states typically pursue through their state departments in order to try to maintain channels, communications with foreign countries, continue to have a presence there to try to understand and figure out what they're doing and what their goals are. Diplomacy is an extremely important part of our foreign policy, but since so much of it is done somewhat behind the scenes, it is not something that the average American or that public opinion is really high on. There are tensions with other countries in the world, and we may sometimes wonder what effect diplomacy's having on this or that. We also have to deal with the fact that diplomats are human beings themselves and are dealing with their own conflicts in a way, particularly depending on the agenda of the president. Are they going to be loyal to the president? Or are they going to deal with tensions that are having to do with getting the job done, doing an effective job despite what the president's agenda might be? The president being their boss, they're going to have to conform to whatever president's goals are, whatever that agenda is at that particular time. But we also have to keep in mind that diplomats are typically hired, they're bureaucrats, they're career diplomats, and they are not necessarily the same as the appointed ambassadors. The appointed ambassadors are the ones that are over the consulates there in each country and have many career diplomats perhaps working for them. The ambassadors are the ones that are appointed by the president that are going to be loyal to that agenda, and the diplomats are the ones going to be doing most of the legwork. But as we've seen just in the recent impeachment proceedings with President Trump, that the diplomats that have been there for a while or perhaps been hired or appointed under previous administrations may not necessarily have that same loyalty to the current president as the ambassadors are that were appointed to serve under him. So that's constant tensions that you have to deal with in this system that adds to a little bit of the distrust or lack of support towards diplomacy as an ongoing vital function. The agency representatives could also potentially be pursuing their own interests in a way, perhaps to enhance their career or to do what they think is right based on their own moral compass. And this is what we call the principal agent problem. That is just another way of saying the boss-employee conflict. Agencies are tasked with performing a function, and they have their goals and their processes and their jobs to perform that may conflict with the goals of the boss at that time. This is a fairly common problem that we deal with in the bureaucracy, because the bureaucrats are typically there as a career doing a job, professionals, and that the upper layer of each bureaucratic agency is the appointed executives, administrators, executive vice presidents, department heads that are only going to be there temporarily serving under that current president's administration. So that is a common problem throughout the bureaucracy, and it's even a little bit more enhanced here because of the foreign policy aspect of it. Interest groups also have quite a bit of influence on foreign policy. In America, pluralism is a very important theory as to describing how our system works, where it's a series of competing interest groups that are putting pressure on government to get benefits for their group. This could range from farmers to corporations to ethnic groups to all types of issue groups that are formed, organized, have resources, raise money, and then have the power to lobby and exert political pressure through providing information, through lobbying campaigns. Lobbying is something that we would spend considerably more time on in another class. Lobbying is simply what interest groups do to get the benefits from government, and they do that by providing the congressman with information and expertise to help them craft any particular legislation. So they're plugged into the process. They can provide services that the congressman cannot provide for himself, may not even have the staff to do that. So it is a very rational and a legal process for interest groups of all types to pursue lobbying. We have to keep an eye on it because it could cross the line into favors and bribes. Campaign contributions is another way of influencing foreign policy by contributing to candidates that are going to perhaps be more apt to listening to your points of view, because politicians, in order to get elected, raise money and they would like to continue or to rely on that additional campaign contributions in the future. So it matters, right? It's when you look at corruption, the United States is incredibly low as far as corruption is concerned when you compare it to other countries in the world. Most democracies are generally lower in corruption. But it does matter because politicians will remember that when somebody has helped them or contributed to them. The military-industrial complex is a interlocking network that includes bureaucracy, the armed forces themselves, the executive offices, the corporations, any type of organizations that get benefits through the military or provide help to the military. So that is also an important influence. And technology that comes out of this military complex has been generally useful, particularly even during war. When we're fighting the war effort, we're putting a lot of expense and effort into trying to win that war with the latest technology, and that could result in new innovations. And that includes even a Cold War, when you look at how we were so competitive with the Soviet Union, that led to the arms race, the space race, and all kinds of other technological innovations as a result of that then go out into the private sector that other people can get use of those. Satellites is an example of that. The military spending, which is quite large in the United States, and that military spending benefits the corporations that are providing goods to them, that hire people, put them to work. Also, research institutes benefit from military spending in order to get these contracts to do research for new technological innovations. Public opinion does matter, but it is a little ironic that public opinion does not have a whole lot of influence, comparatively speaking, on foreign policy, in part because the average American has little interest in foreign affairs, not really all that informed as to what's going on in the political sphere. We're not really too keen on history. And then when you look at foreign affairs, even less so, because we are pretty much focused inwards on our own lives and what the benefits are to the United States, and don't spend a whole lot of effort trying to get to know or understand what's going on out there in the world. So average American has generally little interest in foreign affairs, and so therefore not a whole lot of influence on foreign policy. And as I've said before, there's a general distrust of diplomacy as well as international organizations. The average person in America does not put a whole lot of faith and credibility into those endeavors. In some cases may look at it as expense that could be used in America. And that's one of the things that Donald Trump ran on that helped him get elected, was to kind of pull back from that interest or that engagement in foreign affairs and bring that back into more of a nationalist leaning agenda. And it helped him get elected. We see examples of how we may reach out and engage in treaties, and then they turn out perhaps not to work. Or, for example, if we went out and tried to deal with a dictator such as Assad in Syria in order to try to stop conflict, we come up with an agreement to hopefully settle things down, and then a few weeks later he gets overthrown by a military coup, and then all that effort's just thrown out of the window and wasted. And so therefore people start to look at that and say, well, what's the point? Obviously it does matter. Authoritarian governments, and see that they spend quite a bit on propaganda in order to try to keep their citizens somewhat more positive on what their government is doing, or just covering things up, or suppressing information that would make them look bad. Any public, regardless of what country you live in, is subject to what we call this rally around the flag syndrome, and politicians can sometimes even use this to spike their own popularity if things in the country are not going so well. Here's an example of a rally around the flag syndrome, where George W. Bush was seeing some dropping of his approval ratings, and then right after 9/11, the response to 9/11 that really unified America. And as you can see, just a dramatic spike, almost up to 90% approval ratings. Then once the response to that started to play out, again, we had this is what you might call another spike right here, the attack on Iraq, which was some fairly strong support on that. Various other spikes here, but that's what we call the rally around the flag effect, that people are influenced by the events that surrounded us, is what spiked the approval rating. This sense of patriotism or unity is typically what's behind it. Here's looking at lots of other presidents in the past, and we see some examples. Just backing up a little bit here, George H.W. Bush, the elder, saw a pretty dramatic rally around the flag spike there because of the success of the Gulf War, and then nosedive after that, primarily due to the recession. We see that Jimmy Carter actually had a very huge spike in the matter of just a couple of months because of the Iran hostage crisis that united people behind the president. But then, as we see throughout the next year, the inability to resolve that Iran hostage crisis led to a severe nosedive in approval ratings. So those are some examples of the rally around the flag effect. Another interesting trend we see with almost all presidents is that they generally decline in their approval ratings. The only presidents that ended up higher than what they started with were Reagan and Clinton, and they started at generally lower than average ratings in order to accomplish that. Obama started relatively high, dipped and came back on an upswing, but was still lower than what he started with. FYI, Donald Trump's approval ratings at the very start of his administration were the lowest ever in history, somewhere around 41%. So it's possible that lots remains to be seen, but possible that his could end up higher than what he started with because of that. The media does have some influence, primarily in that it feeds public opinion, not, as we said before, public opinion, not all that strong of an influence on foreign policy, but it is what gives people their information, and then the media itself can provide enough noise, perhaps, to influence foreign affairs. Just the fact that they're reporting on it, watchdog, keeping an eye on government, a critic of government's actions. The media, as we would talk about in more detail in other classes, provides this gatekeeping function of information where they can prime the public by putting it in the front page and playing it up to where we can't help but notice it, and the way it's framed, in that it's important, in the way that it's written about. So those are some things that the media has a pretty significant influence. And of course, the media is an extremely important part of democracy that we will talk about even a little bit more later on when we look at democracy rankings. The freedom of the press is extremely important in freedom rankings, and the media is tasked to hold those in power accountable, question authority. Legislatures, such as the Congress, because of the fact that the president is the initiator in the face of the nation, primary mover of foreign policy, legislatures have typically taken a back seat to foreign policy, but they do have influence, may have a little bit of lag time associated with it. Now, as far as shared power with the president, we've already talked about how the Senate approves treaties, but of course those are almost non-existent nowadays because of the difficulty for the Senate to get 2/3 of approval of any global treaty. They also approve the president's appointments. So there's some shared power there, but more often than not, Congress has given authority to the president. We've already talked about some of those already, such as the blanket resolutions to resolve some conflict or problem in a foreign area. And another thing that we really haven't talked about yet is that Congress has also delegated their constitutional authority of regulating commerce with foreign nations. They've pretty much delegated that to the president. So that's a long, complicated story that goes all the way back to the Depression, when Congress raised tariffs in order to try to help the situation during the Depression, but it just made it worse. So therefore, subsequent legislation gave a little bit more freedom to the president as far as negotiating these trade deals. And then just in the last few decades, they've almost given the president a blank check on trade authority. Fast track authority simply means that the president negotiates the trade agreements and the Congress has to just literally rubber stamp it, and they can't amend it. So that is an interesting transition of power and authority yet again from the Congress to the president. Congress occasionally stands up to the president, and in some cases it may pass legislation that tries to perhaps define some power for them, or they could enact resolutions. Resolutions are more or less statements of what Congress prefers, may not have a whole lot of legal weight to them. One attempt of that was the War Powers Resolution in 1973, which came on the heels of the Vietnam War, which was I don't think there's any doubt that any scholar would say that Vietnam War was a dismal failure. We eventually cut our losses and got out of there, and Vietnam went communist after over a decade of massive expense and 58,000 soldiers dead, average age 19 years old. So in 73, Congress passed War Powers Resolution. Now, they set some strict conditions for war, no real surprise on that, but the rest of these provisions did not necessarily hold up. One of them was that the president consulted before sending troops. Now, the one way the president can get around this is that the president can send a lot of personnel that don't necessarily have to be classified as troops, whether it's reconnaissance, engineers, construction. Lots of personnel can be sent that would not necessarily be military troops. So not a whole lot of problem overcoming this one for the president. Congress also required that the troops be deployed for no more than 60 days. Now, when you look at this one does not have a whole lot of practicality to it. For example, if 500,000 troops were mobilized to a foreign country with airfields being built, barracks being built, aircraft carriers taken over there, and all kinds of equipment, tanks, whatever, being sent over there, and it's going to take probably 2 months to get all that mobilized over there, and then at the end of that 60 days, oh, come on back. Not likely that that's going to happen. Now, this was one that the Congress thought was their key to getting some power away from the president, and this is where the Congress, in this War Powers Resolution, said that they want to be able to withdraw the troops. Would be a legislative veto. In other words, after giving President authorization to go take care of this problem, then they have the power to bring the troops back. However, this was found unconstitutional. The bottom line is that the Supreme Court, not long after this, found that this was unconstitutional because Congress would therefore be violating the separation of powers clause. They can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't authorize the president to execute that war and then take that back from the president. Because of our separation of powers, Congress passes the law and then gives it over to the president for him to execute. Same thing with war. Congress declares the war, passes it over to the president to execute that war. So Congress would have been violating that separation of powers. So the Supreme Court found that provision unconstitutional. So therefore, the War Powers Resolution was generally ineffective very early on. And there's been some attempts to revive. Even at the end of the Iraq War, there was an attempt to bring up a new War Powers Resolution, but it just kind of fell off the table, primarily because of this separation of powers, that the president is tasked with executing that military operation as commander-in-chief. So they're still having to figure out how to monitor that situation. All right, so that concludes the foreign policy chapter, part 2.